Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Flux, and this is General Psychology. Welcome back. Over the last 2 lectures, we've been exploring how we explain behavior. Ours, others, and even entire groups of people. We talked about attribution theory and how we tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt while judging others more harshly. We also saw how biases like the fundamental attribution error and the self-serving bias shape the way that we view the world. But today, we're taking it a step further. We're going to dive into how these mental shortcuts don't just affect individuals, but entire groups of people. We'll explore how stereotypes form, how they can lead to prejudice, and how that prejudice can turn into discrimination. Whether you've experienced this firsthand or you've caught yourself making assumptions about others, today's lecture will help you understand where these biases come from and how you can challenge them. Before we dive in today, let's do a quick review of our last lecture. You see someone struggling to carry groceries and immediately assume they're weak, instead of thinking they might be tired from a long day. What bias is at play here? A, the self-serving bias. B, the fundamental attribution error. C, the actor-observer bias. Or D, the just world hypothesis. If you picked B, the fundamental attribution error, you're on point. You're blaming their struggle on something internal, their strength, without considering their external situation. Which of the following best illustrates the just world hypothesis? A, assuming a student failed an exam because they didn't study, even though the test was unfair. B, believing that people who are poor must not have worked hard enough. C, taking credit for a successful project but blaming others when it goes wrong. Or D, thinking someone is rude for being quiet without considering that they might be shy. If you picked B, you're exactly right. That's just world thinking, assuming that someone's misfortune is a result of their own actions, rather than considering external factors like systemic inequality or bad luck. Now let's shift our focus to today's topic: stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Have you ever caught yourself assuming something about someone just because of the group they belong to? Maybe you thought someone was bad at math because of a stereotype, or maybe you believed someone was untrustworthy based on a snap judgment. Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of those assumptions. Today, we're going to explore where these stereotypes come from, why we hold them, and how they can lead to harmful attitudes and behaviors. Here's what we'll dive into today. We'll start by approaching stereotypes. We'll look at how stereotypes act as cognitive shortcuts and how they influence the way we view different groups. Then we'll take a look at prejudice, examining how stereotypes turn into negative attitudes, and how societal messages can even make people internalize prejudice against their own group. Then we'll dive into discrimination, when prejudice translates into harmful behaviors, both obvious and subtle. We'll discuss stereotype threat, where we'll uncover how the fear of confirming stereotypes can actually affect people's performance and behavior. Then we'll take a look at how we can reduce prejudice and discrimination by exploring how we challenge these biases and can create more inclusive environments. And we'll finish up with a conclusion and some review. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand how stereotypes are formed, how they lead to prejudice and discrimination, and how these biases affect both individuals and entire communities. More importantly, you'll learn strategies for recognizing and challenging these patterns, both in yourself and in the world around you. So let's start with the basics. What exactly are stereotypes? We've discussed stereotypes before in our lectures about cognition, learning, and memory, but now we're examining them in the context of social thought. As a refresher, and in this context, a stereotype is a generalized belief about a group of people. It's a mental shortcut that our brains use to categorize and simplify the world around us. Instead of getting to know individuals, we rely on assumptions about their group to fill in the gaps. Our brains are constantly trying to process an overwhelming amount of information. To make sense of it all, we create schemas, mental frameworks that help us quickly interpret new information. Stereotypes are just one kind of schema. For example, if you hear that someone has a PhD, you might automatically assume that they're intelligent. Or if you see someone wearing a hoodie late at night, you might assume they're up to no good. These shortcuts help us make quick judgments, but they often lead to oversimplifications or inaccurate assumptions. Let's look at a few common examples of stereotypes. Some of these might seem harmless or even positive, but they still reduce people to simplified traits. A few positive stereotypes we might not think as much about include that Asians are good at math, or that women are more nurturing, or maybe that older people are more wise. A A few negative stereotypes you might be familiar with include that teenagers are irresponsible, men are emotionally detached, or immigrants are lazy. Even so-called positive stereotypes can still be damaging because they create pressure to conform to expectations, and they ignore individual differences. So why do we use stereotypes if they're often inaccurate or harmful? It comes down to efficiency. Stereotypes help us make decisions in a complex world quickly, but this efficiency comes at a cost. We overlook individual differences, perpetuate biases, and reinforce social inequalities. It's like using a broad brush to paint a detailed picture. You miss the nuance, and the final results are distorted. Let's look at a study that shows how stereotypes can have real-world consequences. In a study by Carell and colleagues in 2007, participants played a video game where they had to make split-second decisions to shoot or not shoot people holding objects. Some of the people in the game were armed, but some weren't. Here's what they found. Participants were more likely to accidentally shoot unarmed black targets than unarmed white targets, even when they consciously rejected racial biases. This is called the shooter bias, and it shows how deep-seated cultural stereotypes can influence our behavior, even when we're not aware of it. In this way, our stereotypes, even when we consciously hold a different belief, can subtly impact our actions, sometimes in harmful ways with real-world consequences. Let's do an attention check. If you assume someone is good at sports just because they're tall, what are you relying on? A, a stereotype. B, a personal experience. C, an external attribution. Or D, a self-serving bias. If you picked A, a stereotype, you're exactly right. You're making a generalized assumption about someone based on a trait without considering their actual abilities or interests. So we've talked about stereotypes, the mental shortcuts we use to categorize people, but what happens when those generalized beliefs and cognitions aren't just thoughts in our head, but start to shape how we feel about certain groups? That's when we cross into prejudice. While stereotypes are about what we believe, prejudice is about the emotions attached to those beliefs. Prejudice is a negative attitude towards a group of people based solely on their membership in that group. It's not just thinking something about someone, it's feeling a certain way about them or the group they belong to. For example, you might have the stereotype that teenagers are reckless drivers. But if you start feeling annoyed or angry every time you see a teenager behind the wheel, that's prejudice. Prejudice is often fueled by fear, distrust, or discomfort, and it can lead to serious social consequences, even if the person holding the prejudice isn't aware of it. That's because prejudice can be both explicit or implicit. An explicit prejudice is when people are consciously aware of their negative attitudes and may even openly express them. For example, someone who openly says they don't like immigrants or believes certain groups, like people with autism, are inferior. Then there's implicit prejudice. This is when people hold unconscious biases. They might not even realize they have them. These biases can still influence behavior, even if someone consciously rejects the idea of the prejudice. For instance, someone might believe they treat everyone equally, but still feel uneasy around certain groups or make snap judgments without realizing it. Let's look at a powerful study that shows how prejudice can be internalized, even at a very young age. In the Clark doll study from 1940, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark gave black children 2 dolls, one black and one white. They then asked them simple questions, like which doll is the nice doll, or which doll do you like best? Shockingly, many of the children chose the white doll, associating it with positive traits like being kinder or better. The study revealed how deeply societal prejudice can influence people, even leading children to develop negative attitudes towards their own racial identity. The findings from this study were so impactful that they were even used in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case to help end racial segregation in U.S. schools. Prejudice isn't just about beliefs, it's about emotion. Feelings like fear, anger, and disgust often fuel prejudice, even when those feelings aren't based on real experiences. For example, someone might feel uneasy around people from a different cultural background, even if they've never had a negative experience with that group. These feelings can be shaped by societal messages, media portrayals, or cultural norms. Let's reflect. Think about a time when you noticed prejudice, whether in yourself, someone else, or in the media. Maybe you made a snap judgment about someone based on their appearance, or perhaps you felt the sting of prejudice directed at you. How did it feel to recognize that bias? What emotions were tied to it? Discomfort? Fear? Maybe even guilt? Taking time to reflect on these moments helps us become more aware of how prejudice operates in our everyday lives. So far, we've talked about stereotypes, the beliefs we hold, and prejudice, the emotions tied to those beliefs. But what happens when those thoughts and feelings influence how we act? That's when we cross into discrimination. While stereotypes and prejudice live in our minds and hearts, discrimination shows up in the real world, in our behaviors and actions. Discrimination is the unfair treatment of people based on their membership in a particular group. It's when negative beliefs, attitudes, and feelings turn into actions. Actions that limit opportunities, create barriers, or harm others. For example, believing that older people aren't good with technology is a stereotype. Feeling frustrated when working with an older colleague because of that belief is prejudice. Refusing to hire someone because of their age is discrimination. Discrimination can be overt, blatant and obvious, but it can also be subtle and hidden in our everyday interactions. Overt discrimination is easier to identify. This includes clear, intentional acts like refusing to hire someone because of their race or gender, or denying someone access to housing based on a disability or a mental health condition. But then there's subtle discrimination, which is also referred to as a microaggression. These are more indirect, like making assumptions about someone's abilities based on their background, or using dismissive language that reinforces stereotypes. For example, saying, "You're so articulate for someone from your neighborhood," might seem like a compliment, but it subtly reinforces a stereotype about people from that area. Both forms of discrimination can be damaging, but subtle discrimination and microaggressions are often harder to recognize and challenge because they're baked into our everyday interactions. Let's look at some real-world examples where discrimination shows up. Workplace discrimination can include things like pay gaps based off of gender or race, or hiring biases that favor certain groups over others. Housing discrimination includes refusing to rent or sell to people based off of specific racial or ethnic affiliation. Bias in policing and legal systems includes disproportionate targeting of certain groups by law enforcement or harsher sentencing for people based on race or socioeconomic status. Discrimination isn't always about individual actions. It can also be systemic, embedded in institutions, or in laws and policies that create unequal outcomes for different groups. Now we've explored how stereotypes and prejudice can turn into discrimination. But there's another layer to consider here. What happens when people start to internalize those stereotypes and prejudices? When the fear of conforming to a stereotype actually affects how we perform? That's where stereotype threat comes in, and it's more powerful than you might think. Let's unpack how this plays out in real life and how it can hold people back in ways that they might not even realize. Imagine walking into a room knowing that people expect you to fail, not because of anything you've done, but because of a stereotype about a group that you belong to. That pressure, that weight on your shoulders, it's not just uncomfortable, it can actually affect how you perform. This is stereotype threat. It's the fear of confirming a negative stereotype about your group, and ironically, that fear can feed into the stereotype itself. Stereotype threat happens when people feel at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their group. This pressure can cause anxiety, self-doubt, and distraction, which can actually hurt performance, even if the person is fully capable of succeeding. For example, if a woman takes a math test and is reminded of the stereotype that women are bad at math, she might underperform, not because of her actual ability, but because of the anxiety of confirming the stereotype affecting her focus and confidence. We've mentioned this idea broadly when we discussed cognitive load earlier in the semester. These stereotypes create a cognitive load that impairs our performance. A famous study on stereotype threat was conducted by psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson in 1995. In their experiment, black and white college students took a challenging standardized test. For one group of students, the test was described as a measure of intelligence. For another group, it was framed as just a problem-solving task, with no mention of intelligence. What did they find? When the test was framed as a measure of intelligence, Black students performed worse than their white peers. But when the test wasn't linked to intelligence, that performance gap disappeared. Why? The authors interpreted these results as being related to harmful and inaccurate stereotypes about the intelligence of Black people. When the test was linked to intelligence, Black students felt the pressure of stereotypes about their academic abilities. That anxiety then impacted their performance, even though they were just as capable as their white peers when that framing was different. But stereotype threat doesn't just appear in academic settings. It can show up in all kinds of situations. A woman in a tech job might feel extra pressure to prove herself in a male-dominated field. An immigrant who is out shopping may be overly concerned that their accent will make them appear less trustworthy. Or a first-generation college student might worry about living up to expectations in academic environments. In these cases, the fear of confirming a stereotype can create stress that impacts performance, confidence, and even long-term outcomes. Let's do another attention check. Which of the following best describes a stereotype threat? A. Believing in a stereotype about another group. B. Fearing you might confirm a negative stereotype about your group, which then impacts your performance. C. Discriminating against someone based on their group membership. Or D. Assuming a stereotype is true because of a personal experience. If you picked B, you nailed it. Stereotype threat is all about the fear of confirming a stereotype about your group, and that fear can actually lead to underperformance, even when you're fully capable of succeeding. So we've covered a lot about how stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination develop and affect behavior. But now let's talk about how we can break the cycle. The good news is, research has shown that we can challenge and even change these patterns, both in ourselves and in society. So let's dive into some of the most effective strategies. One of the most powerful tools for reducing prejudice is called the contact hypothesis. The idea is simple. Meaningful, positive interactions between people from different groups can reduce prejudice. But here's the key. It's not just about contact. It's about the quality of that contact. The most effective interactions happen when people work together towards a common goal, on equal footing, and in environments that encourage cooperation and respect. For example, think about group projects in school, or cooperating on the same sports team, or maybe community activities where people from different backgrounds come together. These experiences help break down stereotypes and build empathy. Let's look at a classic study that shows how this works in real life. Sheriff's Robbers Cave experiment. The study was conducted over 3 weeks in Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. In this study, 2 groups of boys at a summer camp were separated and encouraged to compete against each other. Pretty quickly, they developed strong group identities, calling themselves names like the Eagles and the Rattlers, and they started to show hostility towards the other group. But this is where it gets interesting. The researchers introduced superordinate goals, tasks that challenged both groups to work together to succeed, like fixing a broken water supply or pooling resources for a movie night. As the boys cooperated, their hostility melted away. They started forming friendships across group lines, showing that working together towards shared goals can break down prejudice and foster positive relationships. Another key to reducing prejudice is recognizing and challenging our implicit biases, those unconscious attitudes that shape our behavior even when we don't realize it. Tools like Project Implicit and Harvard's Implicit Association Test, which we mentioned in Lecture 11.2, can help uncover these hidden biases. On their website, you can take tests that ask you to categorize different words or pictures. The speed that you complete different conditions of the task can actually speak to our own implicit biases in a variety of categories. But awareness is just the first step. The real work comes in actively challenging these biases. A few strategies that can help include seeking out diverse perspectives. Expose yourself to stories, cultures, and experiences that challenge your assumptions. Questioning stereotypes. When you catch yourself making a snap judgment, pause and ask, where is this belief coming from? And does it actually reflect the actions of this group? You can also do this by practicing empathy. Put yourself in others' shoes. How would you feel if someone made assumptions about you based on a stereotype? Challenging implicit bias isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection and growth. Let's reflect. Think about a time when you interacted with someone from a different background and it changed your perspective. Maybe you had a stereotype challenged, or you realized a bias you didn't know you had. What about that experience helped shift your thinking? Was it getting to know the person on a deeper level, finding common ground, or simply seeing things from a new perspective? Reflecting on these experiences can help us understand how meaningful connections can break down barriers and build bridges. We've covered a lot of ground today. Here's some key ideas that I want you to walk away with. Stereotypes are generalized beliefs about a group of people. They can be positive or negative, but often oversimplify and misrepresent individuals. Prejudice is a negative feeling towards a group based on a stereotype. It can be explicit, conscious, or implicit, unconscious. Discrimination is when that prejudice turns into action, treating people unfairly based on their group membership. Stereotype threat shows how the fear of confirming negative stereotypes can actually impair performance, even among capable individuals. Reducing prejudice starts with meaningful positive interactions, the contact hypothesis, challenging implicit biases, and fostering empathy. Before we wrap up, let's take a look at what we learned with a couple of review questions. What is stereotype threat, and how does it affect performance? A. Believing in stereotypes about other groups, which leads to discrimination. B. Fearing you might confirm a negative stereotype about your group, which can impair your performance. C. Avoiding people from different groups to reduce conflict. Or D. Assuming stereotypes are true based on personal experience. If you picked B, you've got it. Stereotype threat is all about the fear of confirming a stereotype, which creates stress and can lead to underperformance. What strategies can help reduce prejudice and discrimination? A. Avoiding people from different groups to prevent conflict. B. Relying on stereotypes to simplify social interactions. C. Engaging in positive, cooperative interactions with people from different backgrounds. Or D. Ignoring biases and hoping they go away on their own. If you chose C, you're spot on. Positive, cooperative interactions, as explained by the contact hypothesis, are one of the most effective ways to reduce prejudice. To stereotype is human. To challenge those stereotypes is humane. Our minds evolved to categorize, but categories can become cages. When we reduce people to traits, we lose the complexity, the raw, vibrant humanness of who they really are. Prejudice and discrimination aren't just societal problems, they're personal invitations. Each bias we confront is an opening, a chance to grow, to understand, to move closer to the kind of world that we want to live in. So as you go forward, keep asking, what am I not seeing? Who have I oversimplified? How can I unlearn the assumptions I've never thought to question? Thanks for joining me today. As always, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. I'll see you in the next module.